Hello and welcome to On the Line, Perspectives on Partition, a series of conversations organised by the Bloody Sunday Trust. I'm Paul McFadden, and in this series I'm inviting people from across the community to share their thoughts on one of the truly seismic events in modern Irish history, the partition of the island 100 years ago. It was an act that resonates in, and some might even say contaminates, politics north and south, east and west to this very day. All of us on this island are affected by partition. Many of us have very strong views about it. Today's guest ticks both of those boxes, but he's also one of those people who's actually decided to do something about it. He's a Derry-born constitutional and human rights academic and one of the founders of Ireland's Future, Professor Colin Harvey. Professor Harvey, thanks very much, first of all, for joining us and for agreeing to, share your thoughts on partition with us. When you look back at it with the benefit of hindsight, what do you have to say about the partition of this island? Was it a benign thing, a malignant thing, a necessary thing? How exactly would you view it with the benefit of 100 years distance?
Well, first of all, Paul, just to thank you very much for the invitation to be part of the discussion, and obviously it's part of the moment of a wider conversation about the year that's in it. My own view is partition has been tragic for the island, been a tragedy really for everyone on the island. Essentially, 100 years of a constitutional avoidance. Also, the way in which partition was done and achieved, and the sort of models that operated north and south for the last 100 years, again, deeply problematic and disastrous. But I don't think I need to tell your audience that for the north, it's been disaster really, very, very problematic. And we've seen and watched the consequences play out, and we're all of us today still trying to manage and think about where we go now and next. So really tragic, traumatic really for many people thinking about what has happened on this island. But I suppose what's encouraging for me is the number of people who are using the present moment to think about where we might be going next in a hopeful way, and how we can try and overcome that really extended exercise in avoiding each other on this island over the past 100 years.
It's interesting to listen to the adjectives you've used to describe partition there. I mean, words like traumatic and tragic and disastrous. But there's a sizable part of the population on this part of the island in Northern Ireland who would regard any change in that status as disastrous and tragic.
Well, we're a very, very divided community here. We're a post-conflict society, and the divisions that you speak of are really hardwired into our politics and our constitutional politics. There's recognizing that there are different narratives, views, and stories about the past, but really I think that's why I wanted to focus in my opening comments around the future, around where we go next, around how we learn the lessons from all of that, and particularly at the moment, really deeply concerned that we don't just simply replicate and repeat mistakes of the past. But it's taken as read. There's no agreement here on some of the big ticket questions. That's why we have the architecture constitutionally that we have, to try and recognize that we disagree on some of the basics, but try and find ways forward, of ways of engaging with each other, pluralistically, recognizing that we're a very diverse society.
Talk a wee bit about Ireland's Future, this vehicle. It's what you're hoping to spark is a civic conversation, civic debate, to do a lot of the what you would regard as necessary preparatory work. But how much buy-in has there been from that section of the population who would owe their allegiance to the United Kingdom rather than to Ireland?
Well, I think again, starting point is really to take it back a bit to Brexit,
Yeah,
the B word, you know, and I think that Brexit has sparked a dramatically new conversations and frameworks about
you
how we
said
have this discussion.
it's opened up a new constitutional vista. Grand
Yeah,
language,
and I
seismic.
think, you know, in a sense now, we're in a position where one part of the island, you know, we have partition, but we now have is effectively repartition in the sense that one part of the island is outside the European Union and one part of the island is inside the European Union. Now, I know we have the famous Irish Protocol, which is being discussed in depth intensely at the moment. But essentially, you know, starting point for me is it would be, it would just be bizarre if we weren't talking about this in the context of Brexit. Like, it would actually be odd not to be pointing out the fact that the European Union in April 2017 said to this region, you have an automatic way back to the European Union in the context where a majority of people voted to remain. So there's a sense in which the starting point to me is that this should be just a normal everyday conversation. You know, I'm not making this up. Ireland's future isn't making this up. You know, it's in the Good Friday Agreement. It's underpinned by international law. It's recognised in domestic law of both states. So, you know, I think it should just be a normal discussion. Obviously, people disagree on the ultimate outcome, you know, and I think you have to absolutely acknowledge that. So there's a new framework, and I just think there has to be an open invitation to people to participate. Like you mentioned, Ireland, Ireland's Future's, you know, a determinedly civic initiative that is, I think, in many ways leading this new conversation. You know, I think for me, a few weeks ago, we had a bit of reflection on the waterfront event in January 2019, where people got together in a sense to say some of this stuff out loud unapologetically. So I think all we can do is to try and encourage and nurture the conversation to make that a welcoming conversation. It's interesting, for example, even this week, we're having this conversation in the context where Ireland's Future is having an event this week. It's trying to engage, you know, people who would self-identify as coming from within the broad sort of unionist community into that space. But there's a recognition that you know, we disagree on the constitutional basics. The clue to unionism and loyalism is in the title, you know, and obviously unionists and loyalists will want to be getting on with the hard work of persuading people to stay in the UK. So I
But
think that's important to underline as well. So,
yeah, but just over a year ago, you suggested to a gathering of lawyers, Franco-British lawyers, you suggested that Brexit could be the iceberg that would sink the UK in its present form. Now, the
yeah,
people in the unionist community whom
yeah.
you are trying to engage, do they see that kind of writing writ large on the wall, or is there an unawareness of it or an unwillingness to accept it? What are you encountering?
My feeling is just pointing to basic factual reality. You know, I think you would have to be, you know, you would have to be living in a different planet not to see that there is significant constitutional turbulence as a result of Brexit. Notable, for example, Colin Eastwood has recently mentioned that he felt the UK was coming to an end. I think many constitutional lawyers, commentators have made similar points. You know, that, you know, look at the situation in Scotland. You know, what I think we're talking now about, was it the last count 20 polls showing a majority seeking independence? Like the message that I and others have been sending for the last number of years is a message of preparation and planning. Like I'm for the we're talking about partition. Right? We're acutely conscious of the mistakes that have been made in this island in the past, and the plea. Look at the language that people like myself and Ireland's Future and others are using. It's the language of responsible management and preparation, because you know we're worried that you know what this region doesn't need is to get bounced into a border poll next Wednesday by a Secretary of State. You know, so you know we've been very careful about the approach, the language, the planning and preparing, respecting the fact that people don't agree on constitutional basics, absolutely. And unionism will go into these referendums arguing for the maintenance of the union, absolutely. But there will be advocates in those referendums arguing for a united Ireland, which of course everybody's perfectly entitled to do via the Good Friday Agreement. So, you know, we're thinking today about partition. It's because of the amount of hurt that's been done in the past on this island that the dominant message at the moment is plan and prepare sensibly and responsibly for the fact that these referendums are likely to happen over the course of the next decade.
Yeah, I mean, I'm interested though, the language that you use there, you're regarding the referenda almost as an inevitability, and you seem to be suggesting that it's maybe not going to happen in the too distant future. But I notice in the Good Friday Agreement, it's within the gift of the Secretary of State. You'll know that better than me as a constitutional lawyer. You'll know that it's for the Secretary of State to exercise that power at any time, and I'm quoting from the agreement here, at any time it appears likely to him that a majority of those voting would express a wish that Northern Ireland should cease to be part of the United Kingdom and form part of United Ireland. There's a lot of power invested in the Secretary of State in that situation. Are you confident that you know, as soon as there is a genuine likelihood of that happening, that a Secretary of State will agree to trigger that process?
It's a great point and a very lively current debate. And as you say, Paul, it's a remarkable aspect of the agreement.
Was it a weakness in the agreement?
Well, I think so much power is vested in the Secretary of State. I just think we need to take a step back. A starting point in this, the agreement's clear that the right of self-determination belongs to the people of this island. But the process, the Secretary of State has a significant role in triggering the process. Also worth bearing in mind, there's two steps there. The Secretary of State can do this at any time, but is required to do this if it appears likely a majority would vote for United Ireland. So it's in the context of that, and in the context of the turbulent constitutional politics of Westminster and the British government, that, you know, people like myself, Ireland's Future, others have put such an emphasis on planning and preparing on this island, on the Irish government engaging, but mainly on civic society, you know, which is why, you know, Ireland's Future has recommended an all-island citizens' assembly, because, you know, there's a very much strongly feel that this should be a civic-led, citizens-led engagement and initiative, and we don't need another sort of elite-led top-down solution. But I don't think the Irish government can stay out of it either. I just think the reality is that, you know, all the evidence suggests we're heading in this direction. So let's just make sure we're ready when the day comes. Let's also make sure that we don't repeat the Brexit mess, that people voting know what they're voting for, that people campaigning on either side of this go to doorsteps when we're allowed to go to doorsteps again, and can actually articulate what the case is. And at the moment, my primary concern is that, you know, what are people going to say? You know, what's the argument? Like, the work needs to be done, and it needs to be done now.
Do you regard United Ireland, and in a way, I mean, it almost requires an hour question to sketch out what we mean by United Ireland. But, you know, in shorthand terms, do you regard United Ireland as an inevitability?
My starting point is that nothing is inevitable. You know, there are many political movements across the world whose projects end in failure. So, you know, we're 100 years on, you know, and Northern Ireland is still very much here. So I don't think anything is inevitable, and that's why, you know, I've and others have made the argument you need to make the case. You need to persuade people. Now, post agreement, it's absolutely clear what's required to initiate and develop constitutional change here. People need to be persuaded. And so you need to build a case. But the outcome in the North, particularly, I think, is by no means inevitable. I think advocates for constitutional change here in unity have a real challenge to persuade a majority of people here to vote for change. That's why I think, the preparation needs to begin. And in some senses, it has started, but there needs to be propositions, a manifesto, a prospectus. What's the offer that will persuade a majority of people here to vote for change?
And I know that the First Minister, the DUP leader, Arlene Foster, is on the record as saying that she did not think there'd be United Ireland in her lifetime. And I mean, I would wish Mrs. Foster long life, good health, and all of that. And that suggests that for a long time there will be no change in the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. But what would you say to someone like Mrs. Foster to encourage her to even contemplate a change in that status? How do you persuade someone who'd be so entrenched in her certainty about the merits of the union?
I'm going to take two steps in that. First step is that what those sorts of statements reflect is an awful complacency. I think on the unionist side, which unionist commentators themselves have pointed out, unionism, for example, is going to have to work a lot harder than simply folding its hands and not making the case, because part of this discussion is that unionism needs to up its game as well. It can't simply rely on the same old status quo arguments to keep a majority of people here attached to Boris and the Brexiteers and whatever they might be going in the future. So I think it reveals an awful complacency in unionism, which many others, in unionism are mentioning themselves. Two things to me in terms of the future. One thing is that we would all be better off in new constitutional arrangements on this island, particularly thinking in the context of the Northwest and the west of this. The division on this island is disastrous, politically, socially, economically, in every way you can think of. So I think be better off. But I also recognize for many people, the arguments are not economic arguments. They're arguments about culture and identity and respect. And I think there's an onus on those making the case for change to be absolutely clear that there will be full respect, there will be robust, secure guarantees for culture and identity of people from Ulster British background, from a British identity in whatever new arrangements emerge. And I think that requires imagination, creativity, and generosity as well, to make clear to people that the arguments aren't just economic arguments, because identity is more than economic arguments, but that unionist identity, British identity, will be absolutely secure in whatever new arrangements emerge. And I think republicanism and nationalism is going to have to stretch itself in that conversation as well to make that clear. Now, some of that is already there in the Good Friday Agreement, something that is often forgotten, that there are robust guarantees there that will carry over into that conversation. But I think there's a lot of work to do. But for me, we'd be better off, no doubt about it, but also need to make clear that everyone will be respected, culture and identity will be protected, there'll be robust guarantees. And maybe a final point is, spent all my life working in the area of human rights. I want to see the conversation about constitutional change framed in a human rights framework, so that we're thinking about everyone on this island. We're maybe not just thinking in the traditional way we've thought about the North in terms of the two main communities. I want to think about everyone who's here and making sure that whatever new arrangements emerge, that the rights of everyone in this society are fully and robustly protected.
You talk about kind of the need, or you imply the need for imagination there. I wonder, I asked the same question of our previous guest, who was a member of the PUL community, and whether she would be open to the possibility of opting in favour of United Ireland. I wonder, would you could you conceive of yourself being open at all to the possibility of in a future referendum or border poll or something like that, plumping for the option of, remaining part of the union? Or is that a stretch of the imagination too far?
I think ultimately people have their different views on the constitutional basics. Like I'm crystal clear, and I haven't been shy about articulating where I stand on that debate. I am firmly of the view that we are better off, and I want to see ultimately new constitutional arrangements on the island. Um, I'm also intrigued to hear the case for the union, and it's a good point, because too often the case in the past has been a rather sort of status quo argument. And I suppose one of the intriguing aspects of the conversation will be to what extent unionism will also begin to engage in a sort of change debate here as well about new constitutional dynamics within the UK. But for me, I am somebody who very committed to bringing about the successful reunification of this island and bringing the current union to an end. And that right is robustly protected in the agreement, but absolutely respect the rights of people to argue the reverse case. I think it's a great point as well, because increasingly to me, looking at what's happening, we seem to be in informal referendum campaigns where ultimately people are beginning to, position themselves in that sort of way informally. And I think that's further evidence of where we're going. And I suppose a final point is that the emphasis on civic dialogue is really, intentional and meant in the sense that I want to listen and hear people speak in these conversations. I want ideas about where we're going to be formed from the bottom up. What we don't need is academics like me and others coming in and telling people, unitary model, federal model, whatever. We can sketch out the parameters, but I'd much rather hear from what people would like to see. And I suppose what I'm worried about is another sort of imposed resolution rather than a resolution that emerges through wide and deep community engagement, where new ideas might emerge that will be listened to and taken seriously, hopefully, in the discussion.
You're very harsh on academics there. I kind of thankful for academics lighting the way, maybe, and illuminating the road and creating space for discussion to happen. I'm very interested, intrigued even by your language. You're talking there about bringing the present union to an end. There's a fair bit of latitude, it occurs to me, in what you're saying, because you're not being prescriptive. You're not saying it has to be, Northern Ireland as it is now, or a united Ireland as most people would imagine it now. You seem to me to be saying there's a great degree of latitude in there for shaping some kind of new, transformed Ireland, if I put it like that, but not the kind of one that most of us have in our heads. Simple, 50% plus one vote and bang, we're into a new 32 county Ireland, not terribly dissimilar to what we have nowadays already in the south.
To me, why would you miss the opportunity that this presents to have a transformative conversation? I think there's a great opportunity now to try and think in a way that is not formulaic, that a way that challenges to create something genuinely new. From my own perspective, done a lot of work, for example, in the area of socioeconomic rights, thinking about, marginalized, vulnerable people in places like Derry. I want to see an Ireland that is genuinely new. I know there's a lot of cliched political sound bites around some of that language, but I'm interested, worked my entire life on human rights and equality. I want to see arrangements that are fully respectful of that. I want to see arrangements that genuinely transform the lives of people who need transformation most. So too many children are growing up across this island in the north whose lives are determined by where they're brought up, their postcode, other things. And to me, the conversation needs to be transformative. So really end where I start. Why would we miss the opportunity this presents to think about how we can, transform the island, north and south? So as, for example, on issues like social and economic rights, that they're actually meaningful, that we're creating proper life chances for future generations, And in that sense, the division on this island for the north in particular, look, for people in Derry and Northwest, this has been a disaster, and this is about making life better for everyone. So
You regard it as an obvious and almost a commonsensical thing then? Are you optimistic that the kind of transformed future that you yearn for will happen? Are you that optimistic?
um, it always involves struggle and working and trying to achieve these objectives. But I'll tell you what, if people stay out of the conversation, if equality and rights activists don't engage because they're worried about engaging in constitutional questions, you can be damn sure that it will get stitched up in a way that isn't transformative. So I think all those north and south who genuinely want to see a transformative conversation cannot be on the sidelines. Like too many of these constitutional conversations, Paul, as you know, they either happen in secret with nobody else there, or they're stitched up in big rooms where people are left at the door. And so it's really a plea for activists on the island, those who want to see meaningful change, to stop standing on the sidelines because they feel they can't engage in a constitutional conversation, and to join in now. Because I'll tell you what, the parameters of this are being shaped now. And if you're not there at the start, sometimes things can get frozen and people can get locked out, So it's really to say this discussion is on across the island, and to urge people, particularly people who want to see it become a transformative conversation that changes people's lives in a very practical sense, to get involved. And I know, look, there's a nervousness about, I'll speak very personally. After that waterfront hall event, when I spoke there, the world came down on my shoulders. Like, I've experienced enormous amounts of criticism for what I have done in the last couple of years, and it has given me enormous pause for thought. But if I stay out of this stuff, if I don't engage, who will? And I hope in a small way, but people like myself stepping into the public sphere and stepping into this debate, it might encourage others to engage as well.
That's why we need academics. Professor
And
Colin Harvey.
but a big believer in academics, but in terms of what we can do, we can sketch out the parameters and do it. And we do have an absolutely vital role in that. You're right, yeah.
Look, you've given us ample food for thought in this half hour or
Thank
so.
You. Thank you.
I think I'll need a few years to do a bit of political binge eating after that. There's so much to consider. But thanks a million for being so brave and so candid in sharing your views.
No
Thanks for joining
very
us.
much appreciate the invitation. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Pleasure on our part.